Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, it's clear that the government is on a slide in terms of its popularity with the voters of New Zealand. That is now abundantly clear. Here we go. National Party continuing to deny the reality of the numbers. The trend has been clear for 2 years, in fairness, in 18 months, that the gap is narrowing and narrowing substantially. Now we've got Phil Heatley cackling in the background there like he's completely lost the plot. Actually, the first person to pick the significance of the narrowing gap was actually a former employee of the National Party, former employee of the Speaker, Matthew Hooton. Matthew Hooton picked this about a year ago. He said that the gap is narrowing, that National Party should not rest on their laurels. But they have. The latest poll that is of most concern to the National Party was in the Sunday Star Times front page in the weekend. National 34%, Labour 28%. A 6-point gap where it was some year and a half ago, a 20% gap.
And who's got
20% down to 6%. Well, Winston Peters fills that gap at the moment together with the Greens, but only a 3% two-party swing would see Labour ahead of National. No wonder the National Party is starting to get worried. In fact, they're getting so worried. What do they do in respect to these polls? The first thing politicians worried about the polls do, they rubbish them. What happened here? The headline is, Key rubbishes New Zealand first result. Key rubbishes New Zealand first result. You know, they're so worried about Winston Peters that he turned up and panned their legislation on foreshore and seabed at Select Committee today. How many questions did the National Party majority ask of Winston Peters at Select Committee, despite his strident criticism of what they were doing? How many?
A dozen?
A dozen, no less. How many?
5?
None.
What?
None. They didn't even have the courage to take on the Right Honourable Winston Peters with one question at Select Committee in support of their bill. What lies behind the slide of popularity in National is people's concern about a lack of integrity. That has two aspects to it. Personal integrity, they are disappointed with the Honourable Phil Heatley, with Bill English, with Pansy Wong, and with overall the lack of standards enforced by the Prime Minister, notwithstanding that he promised to hold higher standards than his predecessors. Right. So they're disappointed with the lack of integrity around ministerial performance, but they're also disappointed with broken promises. They are stopping to trust National. Broken promise after broken promise, they would not increase GST.
That's right.
And they did. They would not increase GST, and they did. They would bridge the wage gap with Australia.
They've given up on that.
And they've given up on that. Their rhetoric around that has disappeared. They were going to close the wage gap by 2025. They had all sorts of weird and wonderful plans that they said were going to do it, like mining in national parks, which they abandoned.
A cycleway?
A cycleway which would not make much difference. They've got no credible plan. They won't even agree milestones between now and 2025, which is their target date, when we all know that the gap is growing larger rather than narrower. Mr Speaker, another area of failed policy is in respect of the major settings of the economy. They said they would not borrow for tax cuts. They borrowed for tax cuts. The amount of that borrowing is increasing by the month. In the last quarter alone, the government has had to acknowledge an extra $2 billion of government deficit, i.e. cumulatively New Zealanders owe $2 billion more to overseas banks through the government's indebtedness than was predicted by the government in their own budget. And why? Why? To fund, in part, tax cuts, 40% of which, or 42% of which, went to the top 10% of income earners. And that's another broken promise by the National Party, because they promised a fair tax system, not a tax system that delivered the majority of tax cuts to those who already earn the most. That is why the government's popularity is sliding. That's why the two-party gap is less than 6%, 6.5%.